So the vulnerability of needing one another. Last week we talked a little bit about how vulnerability is seen as weakness in a lot of cultures, and it's kind of counterintuitive to think about vulnerability as strength. And we think about the vulnerability that we have when we enter into relationship. Just entering into this congregation on a Sunday can be vulnerable for some people. You know, maybe you have a lot on your heart, or you've had bad experiences in other religious settings, or you're not sure what's going to happen if someone sings something that's too tender. Maybe it'll hit you and it'll be hard not to cry, or you have a joy. And a number of months ago, we had someone who came to this space and shared during Joys and Concerns very deeply. And this person shared about a fear of wanting to end his life. And he got up here and said that it was so hard, and things were so hard for him, and he cried. And the whole congregation you could feel the energy shift to hold him in that moment. And right after service, in fact, during the service, people went and sat with him, and he was cared for. But the fact that he brought the most tender and frightening, and thank goodness he did, he brought that fear and that vulnerability. And so if we can create spaces that hold one another, when we're joyful about potty training our 2-year-old, or we're in the most crisis of our life, then we are building a community that is there for one another. Were you ever one of those kids at the dance or in gym class that was standing by the wall waiting to be picked? Kind of stand there and you're like, oh, hoping that you won't be the last one. It's a vulnerable feeling. Perhaps there are other ways in which you've been excluded or unheard in your life. We yearn to belong to something, belong to one another, and there's this human need for belonging. And I know I want spaces where I can let my hair down, where I can be like, look, I got a tattoo. I did. And it's nevertheless, she persisted. And I think, 20 years ago, my grandmother would have flipped in her grave if she knew that that her granddaughter got a tattoo. But times have changed. And for me, that is a bold statement for me to put that on my body and to internalize that. And some of you know the political ramifications of that statement, of feminists speaking up, having their voices heard. Because there were so many times where I felt unheard or unworthy or less than because of culture or religion or whatever. And so to claim our power and to put ourselves out there is both vulnerable and strong, so it's hard. And when I was drawn to Unitarian Universalism as a young adult, I was drawn to how wide and inclusive our community can be, through our universalist heritage that tells us that we all are worthy, that we have an inherent worth and dignity. And many of us at certain times in our lives have been told that we couldn't do something because of who we are or what we can do. And I remember when I was little, I've said this before, I was told, you can't be a minister because you're a girl. And I was like, yes, I can be a minister. And my mom, she grew up and she was in an environment where you had to smile, and get your MRS, not your BA. You want to get married or marry into the right family or wear the right clothes. Be feminine and demure. Don't be too loud with your thoughts or too angry. So in the 70s, she got really angry. She was really angry, and a disaffected, divorced minister's wife. And she said, Julie, don't you trust no man. Don't you trust anybody but yourself. And for her, it was coming out of anger. But it was also coming out of her own liberation. She said, speak your thoughts, live your truth, and don't let anybody tell you that you're not good enough. And, in her own way, she launched me into my own sense of identity. And, we all unravel our childhoods and those messages and hopefully claim for ourselves the ones that give us the strength. And that can be vulnerable too when we look back at past wounds or past hurts. So I wanted to share the story of a woman. I was thinking about, what does it mean to be vulnerable when we need one another? Sometimes as people who come to a recovery meeting, that probably is one of the most vulnerable things you can do, is say, hi, I'm so-and-so, and I'm an alcoholic or an addict or whatever it is, and to be held in that space. But there are plenty of spaces where we are not held, and I was thinking about a woman in the early 1800s. A young woman was born. She lived in a time when a white, wealthy American woman, she had choices that others didn't, but as a woman, she was considered property and did not have power when she got married. She legally belonged to him. Her destiny, her power were tied to what he would permit and what she would risk. Studying the life of this young woman gave me a window into the struggle that people have, a desire to be valued and heard. She had scholarly passions, intellectual curiosity, and social ideals that were thwarted by her gender and the expectations of her class. This woman, in some ways, was a person who stood outside her time, but she also perfectly represented her time period. Julia Ward Howe was born in New York City in 1819. Her father was a savvy Wall Street banker. Her mother was a published poet, but died shortly after giving birth to her. The Ward children were left in the care of their father. They were raised in a strict Calvinist Episcopal tradition, and Julia would later think that was oppressive, and turn to Unitarianism with its ideas of a loving God. And although her father confined the daughters to the home, he did hire tutors for them. She was academically and musically gifted, and so seriously did she regard her studies that she tied herself to a chair until she completed the work that she had set for herself to do. Samuel Ward allowed his daughter to associate only with the extended family that lived on the same street and only hand-picked dinner guests. He dominated their lives with rules. And sometimes a person has to break the rules to survive. When have you broken rules to be authentically yourself? Maybe you grew your hair long. Maybe you listened to bands your family didn't approve of, read books. Did you choose an impractical major? Did you go out and date the wrong person? Julia pursued her own education with a fervor and became a formidable intellect in a time when women faced an uphill battle to receive education and credit for their minds. She profited from an excellent library, which her brother Sam shipped from Europe during his travels and study abroad. Without her father's permission, she read widely from modern philosophers that contrasted sharply with her strict Calvinist Christian upbringing. In the very beginning of her life, Julia was torn between her duty as a daughter and her intellectual curiosity. She was torn between her love of her father, and later her husband would wither her ambitions as a writer, a thinker, and a philosopher. Now, due to her wealth, she was exposed to society, though she was limited by the fact that she could only be at home and had selected guests. But she met with great thinkers of the time. It was her brother Sam who exposed her to Longfellow, Dickens, Charles Sumner, and Margaret Fuller. In a biography of Julia Ward Howe called "Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory," she describes a scene in which Julia is shocked to be introduced to the transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson. She told a friend, "I did not wish to meet this wicked man." This was the type of thinking she had been taught to distrust, yet she noticed in the tall, thin man with blue eyes a quiet smile. She warmed to him later in the day when she caught a glimpse of him at a train stop, walking up and down the platform with a small child on his shoulders. She ended up speaking with him during a snow delay of their trip. The author writes, Emerson, a man of few words, was a patient listener. He sat quietly with this earnest young woman as she expounded on her views of religion and philosophy. Trying to impress him with her thinking, she spoke at length about the great powers of Satan. And when she had finally completed her discourse, his only comment was, "Surely the angel must be stronger than the demon." The transcendentalists of the day were the ones who challenged traditional Unitarians to draw the circle wider, taking on social issues like abolition, workers' rights, and including women. The transcendentalists opened the spiritual door to Unitarianism wider. And Emerson represents that window experience, that time when we open ourselves to the influence of the other. And one time in a visit to Boston, Julia Ward Howe got to hear Emerson lecture. She also heard one of the last sermons of the great Unitarian preacher William Ellery Channing, and took a lot of comfort in his divine love rather than divine judgment. So maybe she was talking less of the great Satan. She also got a chance to meet Margaret Fuller, who was the editor of the Transcendentalist journal, The Dial. She shared some of her poetry with Margaret and came to admire her as an example of a woman living her life and speaking her mind. Margaret Fuller found it hard to believe that the poems she read from Julia were from a sheltered young woman, because she saw in her a taste and a capacity for genius. Julia went on to defy an abusive husband and secretly publish and write. She flouted conventions of the day and tried to use her mind and voice in ways in which women were not encouraged to do. She left her husband eventually, and for the remainder of her life, she traveled the world promoting women's rights, peace, prison and education reform as a preacher, lecturer, and dignitary. She was co-editor and writer of the Women's Journal. She lobbied for suffrage and human rights. And she was instrumental in creating Mother's Day, which she envisioned as a day of solemn council where women from all over the world would meet to discuss and achieve world peace. This is much different than the Mother's Day cards that we give each year. So we think about, how did this young woman become this powerhouse? And I think we think of the times in which we are open. You know, if we're closed off and can only believe what we are taught, then there isn't a window. But when there is that window of listening, like she listened to Emerson, she listened to Margaret Fuller, and to be willing to be changed, to be willing to enter into conversation, is what leads a lot of us into doors like these, is that we don't stand where we start. We enter a journey together and know that we can learn from one another. My grandmother was a proper woman who had ideas about the proper way to do things about a mile long, proper ways to dress. And in her early 70s, she began a slow journey into Alzheimer's. And it worsened as my mother got sicker with lung cancer. The most important things to my grandmother were church, family, and appearing a certain way. I want to make an impression. You know, she wanted to be grand and lovely and everything to be, appear fine. And as she began to lose her memory and her personality changed with Alzheimer's, she had finally gotten to this retirement community, and it was called the Manor. And she was so proud to be in this space. It was a proper Methodist home where she had always hoped to retire. And they couldn't handle her wandering around, and so she had to leave. And also her brother and sister were embarrassed by her and stopped taking her to church. All the ways of belonging were stripped from her, and that really accelerated her illness. She lived with my brother for a while, and then she went to live in a country nursing home that she probably would not have stepped foot into before she began to change. But that place, in that simple country backwoods place, she received excellent care. She was treated with dignity, and she was valued and danced with, and a lot of her racism was shed away as she would dance with people of color. She would dance with whomever engaged with her, and her joy of belonging was apparent. When it came time for her funeral, one of the attendants, one of the nurses, wanted to sing because she loved Miriam. She loved Miriam, and we were pretty angry at my uncle and my aunt. And so my sister, in a typical Southern kind of backhanded way, said, well, bless your heart, why don't you come sing at the funeral? And so she had a cassette tape, and she sang a country hymn in the most simple, and she played that tape, and my whole row of proper relatives was horrified. They were like, oh. But it was beautiful to see that this woman found a belonging for my grandmother, and when those that she grew up with, or the places that she could not belong. And so we think about the vulnerability of belonging, the vulnerability of losing capability. Who will take care of us? Who will welcome us? And we think about this space, if someone comes up and says something a little hard to hear, a little awkward, what is the welcome that they have? So we look at planet Earth from this powerful telescope. What would you see, if you were, we've been hearing about all these UFOs, If you were a little green man or a Vulcan from, planet Vulcan, what would you see on this planet? Would you see different animals, the United States, Africa? Now, what you see is one big green and blue ball. Everywhere we go is where we are. And when we think about the distant parts of the world, and we think about all the parts that we are one living organism, consisting of moving parts that produce oxygen, carbon dioxide, essential nutrients, and evolving. And if we think about our ecosystems, we even have an ecosystem within ourselves. I don't know if you've heard about the microbiome in our own bodies and how it interacts with others and with the world. We think about the idea that we are connected in ways that we don't even understand. We hear trees that send signals to each other through the forest, and elephants that communicate through vibrations in the earth. What are the ways in which we communicate our love? What are the ways in which we communicate our need and our showing up for one another? It can be in a glance. It can be in that shift in energy as we're held in our hardest times. But our deep connection is something that gives us life. It saves babies. It saves worlds. And we can be there for one another. So I want to close this with the wonderful words of Wayne Arneson. Take courage, friends. We got lots of snow. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone.